Buffalo, New York, 1901. And something is wrong with the picture. The Pan-American Exposition draws millions of visitors to marvel at electricity, steel, and the cascading promise of a new century. But tucked between the midway attractions and the food concessions is a building that does not belong in any category the fair's organizers have prepared for. Inside, behind glass panels warmed by water reservoirs and lined with felt, premature infants lie in wooden boxes breathing, being fed on schedule, charted by nurses who move through the room with the quiet efficiency of a hospital ward that has no right to exist at this address. 4,000 people file past on a single afternoon. The admission price is 25 cents. The man running the operation wears a white coat and speaks with a European accent and holds no hospital privileges recognized by any American medical institution. The babies are not props, they are patients. The hospitals in Buffalo had refused to take them, had classified them as non-viable, had sent their families home carrying the quiet institutional vocabulary of the inevitable, the precise, professional language that institutions reach for when they have decided, in advance, that certain outcomes are not worth attempting and certain lives are not worth the resources required to sustain them. The man in the white coat had taken them instead. He had moved them into his exhibit, placed them in his machines, assigned his nurses to their care, constructed feeding schedules and observation logs and weight charts, and most of them had survived. Not some of them, most of them. And that is the first detail that does not fit the official story. Not the spectacle of it, not the carnival address, not the admission fee collected at the door, but the outcome. Outcomes in medicine are supposed to follow credentials. Credentials are supposed to follow institutions. And institutions, in 1901, had decided that premature infants were not a clinical category requiring dedicated infrastructure. They were a statistical category. The category was called non-viable, and its endpoint was called natural, and the paperwork was already designed to accommodate it. To understand why that decision was made, and why the man who proved it catastrophically wrong was subsequently erased from the record of medicine, you have to go further back to Paris. In 1878, when a French obstetrician named Stéphane Tarnier visited a zoo and watched a machine keeping fragile newborn chickens alive, and understood, in that unremarkable afternoon, something that the entire apparatus of Western medicine would spend the next 6 decades pretending he had never understood at all. Tarnier was not an inventor by temperament or by training. He was a clinician, methodical, attached to written records, committed to outcomes in the way that serious obstetricians tend to be, which is to say both professionally and personally. Because the outcomes he was tracking were human lives, measured in days and weeks rather than years. What he observed at the Jardin d'Acclimatation in Paris was not a metaphor and not a curiosity. It was a mechanism. Controlled warmth, sustained and enclosed and measured, kept fragile newborns alive. The principle required no leap of imagination to transfer from chickens to human premature infants. He commissioned Odile Martin, the zoo's director, to construct a device along the same lines for the premature ward at the Maternité Port Royal. A wooden box lined with felt, heated by a water reservoir beneath the floor of the chamber, with a glass observation panel set into the top. No electricity, no sterile field in any modern clinical sense, nothing elegant about its construction. The device was called a couveuse French for brooding hen, and Tarnier introduced it to the ward in 1878 and began recording what happened next with the same methodical discipline he applied to every other aspect of his plan. Practice. The mortality rate for premature infants at Port Royal had been running at approximately 66% before the couveuse arrived. Within 2 years of its introduction, that figure had dropped to 38%. Tarnier published the numbers in his hospital mortality reports. The results were not ambiguous. They were not technically contested by anyone who examined them with any seriousness. They were legible, reproducible in their logic, and available to any physician in France or beyond who read the relevant literature. And for more than a decade after publication, no other French hospital adopted the device. The data traveled. The practice did not. Something about that sequence does not add up. And the explanation, when you follow it carefully through the institutional record of the period, is more unsettling than simple conservatism or professional inertia. Pierre Boudin was Tarnier's student and then his colleague, and eventually his successor at Port Royal, and he grasped what the Couveaus represented more completely than anyone else working in European medicine at the time. Where Tarnier had addressed the problem of thermal regulation, Boudin addressed the problem of the whole infant, the nutritional management, the parental relationship, the systematic observation that could transform survival from an occasional accident into a repeatable clinical protocol. He insisted that mothers participate in feeding their premature infants rather than being separated from them, which was the institutional default of the period, justified on hygiene grounds but producing, in Boudin's assessment, outcomes worse than the problem it claimed to solve. He introduced written nursing observation logs, systematic weight tracking measured against developmental markers, and scheduled physician review at defined intervals. He documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was the mechanism by which a practice became a protocol, and a protocol became a standard of care. In 1900, he published the accumulation of that work in a clinical text called Le Nourrisson, the Nursling, a record of methods and outcomes that remains, by any fair historical evaluation, one of the foundational documents of neonatal medicine. Boudin's clinic worked. The data was published, accessible, and available in translation to any physician who sought it. American medical institutions maintained active correspondence with their European counterparts. British hospitals read French clinical literature, and yet American and British hospitals looked at the evidence assembled in Le Nourrisson and declined, collectively and without formal published explanation, to build incubator wards. The standard historical account offers cost as the primary explanation, alongside a general institutional conservatism toward unfamiliar practice. But the pattern of refusal, consistent, prolonged, geographically broad, maintained in the face of published outcome data that was never seriously challenged, suggests something structurally deeper. And this is where the first and most important twist in this story becomes impossible to avoid stating plainly. The incubator was not rejected because it failed. The data proved, clearly and repeatedly, that it worked. It was rejected because the patient it served had not been granted the institutional status of a patient worth treating. Premature infants in the 1,880 seconds and 1,890 seconds were not a treatable clinical category in the American or British medical imagination. They were a vital statistics category, and that category was labeled non-viable. And the system had been constructed around that label with enough internal consistency that challenging it required not just a new device, but a wholesale reclassification. New ward space, new staff training, new budget lines, new entries in mortality tables that had not previously included a column for premature infant recovery, because premature infant recovery had not previously been treated as an outcome the system was responsible for producing. The incubator was not a dangerous idea. It was an expensive administrative reclassification of human beings from one category to another, and the institution had every structural incentive to defer that reclassification indefinitely. The logic of the institution was not cruel. It was colder than that. It was economical. Into this landscape, sometime in the early 1,890 seconds, stepped a man whose origins remain, even now, genuinely resistant to clean documentation. The name he used in America was Martin Cooney. His claimed background placed him in Boudin's clinical circle in Paris. He described himself as a student of Boudin's, a claim that historians have neither fully confirmed nor definitively disproved, and which Boudin himself, in the surviving record, neither explicitly endorsed nor retracted. His medical credential, as he represented it, derived from a European institution. Though which institution, and whether that credential constituted a recognized medical degree by the standards of any country in which he subsequently operated, has remained a subject of unresolved scholarly scrutiny for more than a century. The credential question matters not because it determines whether his methods worked and the outcomes answer that question, but because it became the structural mechanism by which everything he built could later be classified as outside the boundary of legitimate medicine, and therefore outside the boundary of institutional memory. What is documented, beyond dispute, is this. In 1896, at the Berlin Great Industrial Exposition, Martin Cooney organized and operated an exhibit displaying 6 live premature infants in functioning cuveuses, staffed by trained nurses and wet nurses recruited from maternity wards, operating on the protocols Boudin had developed at Port Royal. The infants survived. The exhibit drew enormous crowds of paying visitors who came to watch the machines work and left having witnessed, without knowing it, a clinical demonstration that no hospital in Germany had been willing to stage. In 1897, he brought a version of the exhibit to the Victorian-era exhibition in London, again with live infants, again with a nursing staff maintaining documented clinical protocols, again with survival outcomes that compared favorably with anything the surrounding hospital system could have offered the same infants had they been admitted through a conventional door. He charged admission at both exhibitions. The revenue covered the nurses, the wet nurses, the coal for the heating reservoirs, the equipment, the charts, the feeding supplies. Every operational cost of a functioning neonatal ward dressed in the language of public spectacle because no other language was available to him. After Berlin, no hospital approached him. After London, no institution sent a representative to examine his records or request his outcome data. No physician who attended either exhibit filed an institutional report recommending adoption of his methods. 8,000 babies across 4 decades, and not one hospital asked to see his charts. In 1903, Cooney established a permanent exhibit at Luna Park on Coney Island, New York, and it did not close for 40 years. The exhibit was not seasonal. It was not intermittent. It operated continuously through 2 world wars, through the Depression, through every administrative and regulatory revision the city of New York imposed on its public health infrastructure between 1903 and 1943. It was, in operational terms, a neonatal intensive care ward. Premature infants were transferred from hospitals across New York City hospitals that had classified them as non-viable, that had no dedicated ward for their care, that in documented cases directed families explicitly to the Coney Island address with the specific instruction that the man there might be able to help. The transfers were almost never formalized in hospital paperwork. No standard institutional record of official referrals survives in the administrative archives of the hospitals involved. What exists instead are the accounts of families, the outcome records maintained by Cooney's own staff, and the infants themselves who arrived at the exhibit sometimes weighing less than 2.5 pounds, fed through careful nursing protocols, warmed in the couveuses, tracked on weight charts, and discharged weeks or months later into the arms of parents who had been told by credentialed physicians in affiliated institutions that the child would not survive. Cooney charged the hospitals nothing. He charged the families nothing. He charged the public 25 cents to observe the ward through the glass, and he ran the entire operation on that revenue for 4 decades, without institutional subsidy, without hospital affiliation, without a single line in any public health budget in the city of New York. The hospitals knew exactly what was happening on that boardwalk. They sent the babies themselves. And here, the second twist enters the frame. Because the silence of the American medical establishment around Coney across those 4 decades was not the silence of an institution operating in ignorance of what was occurring at his address. City health inspectors visited the Coney Island exhibit multiple times during its operational life. Officials from the New York City Department of Health examined the facility, assessed its practices, and cleared it to continue operating. The records of those inspections and the portions that have survived describe a functioning medical operation. Trained nursing staff, documented feeding protocols, hygienic maintenance of the equipment, systematic outcome tracking. Connie's reported survival rate across his career ran above 85% for infants who entered the exhibit alive. That figure, sustained across 40 years and approximately 8,000 patients, represented a standard of neonatal care that no American hospital could benchmark against. Because no American hospital operated a premature infant ward during most of those 40 years, the medical establishment did not ignore Cooney from ignorance. It ignored him from a calculation deliberate, structural, and self-protective. Acknowledging what he was doing would have required a formal institutional response. The only honest formal response available was an admission that a man operating out of a carnival on the edge of Brooklyn, a man whose credential was European and unverifiable within the American system, and whose funding model was a sideshow gate, had been providing a standard of premature infant care that the credentialed, affiliated, institutionally legitimate medical apparatus of the northeastern United States had, for 4 consecutive decades, chosen not to provide. The silence was not an absence of knowledge. It was a decision made in full possession of the facts by people who understood exactly what they were deciding and what they were declining to say out loud. The structural architecture supporting that decision was being built at exactly the same moment Coney was building his ward. In 1910, Abraham Flexner, an educator commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, published a comprehensive evaluation of medical schools across the United States and Canada. The Flexner Report assessed every institution against a standardized set of criteria: laboratory facilities, hospital affiliation, faculty credentials, curriculum structure, and found the majority critically deficient. The reform cascade that followed was sweeping and largely beneficial. By the early 1932, more than half of American medical schools had closed, consolidated, or been absorbed into universities. The medicine that emerged was more scientifically grounded, more systematically credentialed, more rigorous by measurable standards. But the architecture of that reform was built entirely around institutional affiliation. A practice was legitimate if it was taught in an accredited school and performed in an affiliated hospital. A practitioner was credentialed if their degree came from a school the American Medical Association recognized. Cooney's European credential did not map onto this architecture. His operation had no hospital affiliation. His funding model had no institutional equivalent. He existed in a structural category the new system had no mechanism to evaluate, because the new system evaluated institutions and their affiliations, not the outcomes produced by practitioners operating outside those affiliations. The Flexner Report runs to 114 pages. Premature infant care does not appear in it once. Whether that omission reflected a deliberate exclusion, a structural blind spot, or simply the logical consequence of a framework unable to perceive medical practice occurring outside institutional walls, no historian has definitively determined. The effect was the same in any case. Flexner didn't mention it. 114 pages, and not a word. By 1939, County brought his exhibit to the New York World's Fair, a fair whose organizing theme was the world of tomorrow, whose gleaming corporate pavilions promised that science and planning had resolved the problems of the past. He was somewhere in his late 60s, his precise birth year being as contested in the available records as nearly every other biographical detail about him. He gave interviews. He spoke to journalists who found him a compelling and unusual figure, and occasionally to physicians who visited the exhibit with the manner of men examining an anomaly rather than consulting a colleague. The American hospital system was, By 1939, beginning in scattered and uneven ways to construct premature infant wards. The impetus was not clinical consensus or outcome-driven policy reform. It was the expanding infrastructure of wartime medicine, the hospital financing arrangements emerging from the New Deal era, the basic economic logic of institutional scale that finally made dedicated neonatal wards financially viable. The wards opening in the early 1942 implemented protocols that were, in their essential operating logic, the protocols Boudin had described in 1900 and Cooney had practiced since 1896. Sustained warmth, continuous nursing observation, nutritional management, systematic outcome recording, regular physician review. The hospitals built what he had built. They did not say his name. Cooney closed the Coney Island exhibit in 1943, not because of failure, not because of investigation or scandal, or any form of legal challenge, but because the hospitals had finally constructed what he had been operating for 40 years. The framing available to the institution was tidy. The Carnival exhibit had been a temporary and eccentric measure, now rendered obsolete by the proper establishment of hospital-based neonatal care. No medical journal published a retrospective. No public health authority released a summary of 40 years of operational outcomes. No hospital issued a formal acknowledgement. Connie died in 1950, and the Journal of the American Medical Association did not publish an obituary. The New England Journal of Medicine recorded nothing. The Lancet was silent. A man whose documented operational history suggests direct responsibility for the survival of approximately 8,000 premature infants, 8,000 people who would otherwise have been classified as non-viable and permitted to die within hours or days of birth, left no trace in the official record of American medicine. That is not an oversight. Oversights produce gaps, inconsistencies, the occasional corrective footnote added in a later edition. What Cooney left behind in the official record was a smooth, continuous surface, a narrative with no visible seam where he had been excised. The mechanism of that excision is legible in the textbook literature of the following decades. Histories of neonatal and pediatric medicine, written through the 1,950 seconds, 1,960 seconds, and 1,970 seconds, consistently locate the origin of organized neonatal intensive care with hospital-based physicians operating within credentialed, affiliated institutions. Julius Hess, a Chicago physician who established a premature infant station at Sarah Morris Hospital in 1922, appears frequently as a founding figure, a legitimate attribution. Since Hess produced important and well-documented clinical work within the institutional framework the era recognized, but Hess established his station 26 years after the Berlin Exposition, 19 years after Coney Island opened. And his published methods drew explicitly on the Boudin lineage that Cooney had been applying in public practice for 2 decades before Hess broke ground on his ward. The historiographical pattern is consistent across the texts of the period. Tarnier and Boudin receive brief acknowledgement as European precursors. Cooney is reduced to a single anecdote, or omitted entirely, and the narrative of NICU development begins with the hospital. The history of the incubator was written by the people who arrived last, and they wrote it from the address they recognized, the address that matched their credentials, their institutional affiliations, and their sense of where medicine was permitted to originate and be recorded. The evidence that survived did not survive in archives. It survived in people. Beginning in the 1,970 seconds and continuing through the early 2000s, individuals in their 60s, 70s, and 80s came forward with testimony of a specific and irreplaceable kind. They had been premature infants at the Coney Island exhibit. Their parents had been told they would not survive. They had spent the critical early weeks or months of their lives in a glass-fronted warming box on a Brooklyn boardwalk, cared for by nurses working under the direction of a man the medical system would subsequently decline to acknowledge. At least one named survivor gave recorded testimony, describing what her parents had told her, the desperation of the referral, the strangeness of the address, the experience of collecting a living child from a building surrounded by carnival noise. These survivors' birth records showed no evidence of premature birth treatment in any hospital intake record. Their early medical history had occurred in a building the institutional system had visited, cleared, and then chosen not to remember. The archive that could not be suppressed was biological. It persisted in the bodies of 8,000 people scattered across the country, aging through the decades, their continued existence constituting the only remaining document of a 40-year medical operation the system had decided not to preserve. Walk into any neonatal intensive care unit in any major hospital today and examine the equipment surrounding a premature infant. The incubator maintains a precise internal temperature and controls humidity and monitors oxygen saturation, heart rate, and respiratory rhythm in continuous real time. Nurses log feeding volumes and intervals according to structured protocols. Physicians review weight trajectories against developmental benchmarks at defined intervals. Parents are encouraged in the formal language of current guidelines issued by the American Academy of Pediatrics to maintain close physical proximity to their infants, to participate actively in feeding, to hold and speak to their children as frequently as the infant's clinical stability allows. These are Pierre Boudin's protocols, described in Leneur-Hassan in 1900. These are the practices Martin Coney implemented at the Berlin Exposition in 1896 and sustained, without interruption, on Coney Island for 40 consecutive years. The Covoses logic is present in every incubator, in every neonatal unit, in every hospital on Earth. The name above the door in those units is not Cooney's. Standard institutional histories cite Julius Hess as the foundational American figure. Julius Hess gets the footnote. Martin Cooney gets the silence. There is a lot on Coney Island where the Luna Park exhibit stood for 40 years. No plaque marks the address. No memorial identifies the building's former function. No medical institution, historical society, or public health authority has erected a marker acknowledging the 4 decades during which that location operated as the most consistently effective premature infant care facility in the United States. The absence is its own kind of archive, a document written in the negative space, where acknowledgement was withheld year after year by institutions that had every resource and occasion to offer it. The question this story has been building toward is not whether County was legitimate. The outcomes answer that without ambiguity. It is not whether the babies survived. 8,000 people answer that. The question is structural and institutional and uncomfortable in the specific way that questions about power tend to be when the evidence is too clear to dispute and the silence is too consistent to explain as accident. When a medical establishment observes, over 4 decades, a non-affiliated practitioner producing survival outcomes it cannot match, when its own inspectors visit and clear the operation, when its own hospitals refer patients to the address, when it eventually builds quietly and without attribution the wards the practitioner designed, what does that sequence reveal about what the institution was actually measuring? The pattern suggests it was never measuring outcomes. It was measuring affiliation. It was measuring the credential, the address, the framework, the language of the application. And when the framework finally expanded to accommodate the practice, the man who had proven the practice possible was left outside the new boundary, where the record could not reach him and the obituary column had no space for someone who had never been officially inside. The machine survived because its logic was irrefutable and because the infants it saved were eventually too numerous and too visible to deny. What was erased was the proof that the logic had been demonstrated first in a building the institution had never officially entered, by someone the institution had never officially recognized, funded by 25 cents, collected at a door the institution considered beneath its dignity to walk through. The machine survived. The man was erased. And somewhere in that gap between 8,000 lives and 0 obituaries, between 40 years of documented outcomes and an unbroken institutional silence, is a question that medicine has never formally answered. Not about Martin Cooney, about what a system reveals when it decides that the credential matters more than the child, that the address matters more than the outcome, and that the history of a practice belongs to the institution that adopted it last, rather than the man who proved it first.